Thank you everyone for being here. You should see a note here that the meeting is being recorded. You can feel free to turn off your video or your sound if you're not comfortable with that. But we will be recording this and sharing the full video of the session, plus the PowerPoint and all of the materials on our website after we're done here today. So you can take notes if you like, but please feel free to just enjoy and participate. I also want to give you a quick tip, Zoom tip, that if you go over to the chat and click on the 3 little dots next to each other at the bottom of the chat function, click on that, it will give you the option to save the chat. So all of the resources and materials that we're going to be sharing will be shareable there. You can save that chat and find it there. All right.
Oops.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, a lot younger than we are. Okay. Well, you take care and.
Okay. And folks, if you're not unmuted, if you could please mute yourself while we're having the meeting, that way we'll be able to hear each other better. So I think we'll get started. Can I just get a nod? Can folks see my screen that's been shared?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so once again, just to introduce myself, for those of you who have just joined us, my name is Dana Lewinter. I am the Director of Municipal Engagement at CHAPA. Thank you all for being here for our Greater Boston Regional Meeting. This is our 6th regional meeting that we've done over the last couple of weeks, and we are really excited to be in the Greater Boston region with you, even if it's virtually, and we have a lot of great information to share here today with you. For folks who may not be familiar with CHAPA, just wanted to let you know about us. Our mission is to encourage the production and preservation of housing that's affordable to low to moderate income households and individuals, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities. We do that through a lot of different things: policy, programs, really convenings. So I encourage you to check our website out to learn more about all of the work that we do, and you'll hear a little bit about some of it today as we go through. I want to thank our annual regional meeting sponsor, Bank of America. They've been our sponsor for a while now, and really couldn't do this work without them. So thank you once again to Bank of America. And thank you to our local participating co-hosts. We have a bunch here today in Greater Boston, and I know there were more that we could have added to the list. We're going to hear from all of them after we get launched here. So thank you to them. It's really important for us to be able to hear from people who are doing this work in their local communities. We're proud to be partnering with many of these folks. So before we get going with our agenda, I'm actually going to hand it off to my colleague Whitney Demetrius, and she's going to start us off with a poll. So Whitney, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Dana. So I'm going to launch that poll now, and I'll look for some non-indicators that you can see it. It's just a survey of a few questions, one so we can know who's on the call with us, and then also just a series of questions. And somehow seems that I don't see it, so I'm going to ask for some indicators from everyone if you're still able to see that. It looked like I had the poll and launched it, and now I can't see it. But if you can, that's good. Yes, okay, great. So take a few moments to complete that, and then we will share the results and the answers.
And while we're waiting for that poll, for those of you who are just joining us on the call, we're sharing in the side chat your name and your organization or your community that you are representing here today. We don't have time to go around. We have almost 100 people on here now. We have over 200 registered. We won't have time to go around and say who's here, but we'd love to know who was able to join us here today. So just take another minute or two to complete that that survey or poll, whatever you want to call it, I want to let folks know there are wrong answers, but that's okay. We want to just hear from you what you think the right answer is, because it's going to help us to really have the conversation that we're going to have here today. So how are we doing on the poll, Whitney? Can we see how many have responded?
So somehow I can no longer see the poll and how folks are doing with that. I'll call on my colleagues to look and see. It seems like it says I'm logged in somewhere else, but take a few more minutes to complete that, and I'll still go over the answers with us to hopefully guide our conversation today.
Okay, great. If Eric Shupin, if you're on, you may be the one who has the ability to see that poll. Just a quick shout out that you might be able to see.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I do have the poll results, and about half of the people have responded, so thank you, and I can provide updates. Just let me know when you want me to share.
Okay, let's give it just one more minute for folks who are just getting in, and then we'll close that poll. Sorry to put you on the spot there, Eric, but I know you handle these calls very well all the time, so you're ready to jump right in.
Like a basement. Yeah, there's like no shoes.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and close that, and we can give Whitney can go over the actual answers to all of the responses that you guys were giving.
Thanks. I just pulled, and then I can share the results.
Great.
All right, so Eric, how about you help me out? The first question is, who is represented? Who do we have on the call with us today?
Sure. So this afternoon we have local municipalities. We have about 15% of us, eight folks joining from local municipalities. 20% of us, 11 of us, are from statewide organizations or agencies. This is exciting. About 40% of us are from a local community organization. Then we have some local residents, some consultants, and then a bunch of others that have been listed themselves as other.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eric. So happy to have so many of you all on our call today. The following question is, according to the American List, what percentage of American renter households were unable to make their housing payments in May of 2020? And that actual answer there was 22%. 22% of renter households. The following question talks about homeowner households. How many of them were unable to make their housing payments in May of 2020? And that also was 22%. 22%. The following question came from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's report on the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on New England homeowners. And the question there was, how many New England households were at risk of missing the rent or mortgage payments due to coronavirus-related job loss? And that actually was more than 1 million. More than 1 million households in New England. The following question comes from the same report and asks, under the best case scenario, how many lost housing payments is likely to accrue in New England from April through July? So under the best case scenario, the answer was $1.42 billion. $1.42 billion. Really remarkable numbers there. The following question comes from the MAPC update to the COVID-19 layoff housing gap report and asks, what percentage of standard unemployment claims came from the following, just these 3 occupations: food preparation and serving, office and administrative support, and sales. And of just those 3 occupations, it made up 40%. 40%. And then I'll call on my colleague, Eric, to help me answering the last question, because we want to get a sense of how many of you all have joined us in the past for our regional meetings.
Well, this is a real, I like this result. We have half of you, 50% of us, have joined us before, and half of you are all first-time participants. So that's really great, and wanted to thank you all for joining us for the Boston Regional Meeting.
Thanks, Eric. Hand it over to Dana. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric, for stepping in, and thank you, Whitney, for walking us through that. So I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen. I'm excited to have all of you here joining us. as my colleagues mentioned. So here we go. Thank you. All right, so our agenda today, we're going to hear some regional updates from our partner organizations. We're going to then hear some policy updates from our policy staff at CHAPA, a little bit about our municipal engagement initiative from Whitney, and then some regional sharing, some data and some points that we've been listening to from our co-sponsors. And then we're going to have a discussion. We're going to try it not going into breakout groups. We think that we have a better discussion when it's all of us, but this is a large group. I want to acknowledge that. So in order to facilitate that, if everyone could keep themselves on mute, and we will allow for hand raising when we get to the discussion section, and also feel free to share resources and materials in that chat function. And then we'll just share a few ways that you can join us for upcoming meetings, events, and ways to stay connected. All right, so let's go straight to our regional updates from our partner organizations. Oops, excuse me for that. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see folks' face, and we will start at the top of our list. I think actually, Chris Norris, were you able to get into the meeting? Is Chris able to get in yet? I don't hear from him. So let's start with the folks from MACDC. Are either Joe Kreisberg or Don Bianchi on the call, and they can share?
Yeah, hi, Dana. This
Hi,
is
Don.
Hi. Thanks, Dana. I'm Don Bianchi from the Mass Association of CDCs. And Dana and Whitney asked me just to highlight some of our statewide advocacy around housing. We are working with CHAPA on trying to increase the resources to help tenants pay their rent. There's Raft, there's state CDBG funding, there's encouraging localities to use their CPA money or CDBG money for emergency assistance to tenants. And I know CHAPA is going to provide an update on where the Raft money stands, but that's obviously top of our mind on advocacy, particularly with the moratorium expiring in August potentially. Secondly, we're working with the state, DHCD, and its quasi-public lenders, MHP on mass housing, on working with nonprofit rental property owners who are not necessarily getting the income that they've anticipated, and they have mortgage payments due to the quasi-public. So we're working on that. We think we're making some headway on that, but that's an ongoing effort. Thirdly, we are working to expand funding for first-time homebuyer counseling and foreclosure prevention counseling through Mass Division of Banks funding under a program called Chapter 206, because we believe that there's going to be a great need for, particularly for homeowners, to get the counseling they need to avoid foreclosure once the moratorium ends. So we're advocating for more funding in both the current year and in fiscal 21 from the state for that. And finally, we are working on something called an act relative to neighborhood stabilization. It's basically trying to get funding for weak market areas in gateway cities and small towns, for rehab of distressed properties and vacant properties, technical assistance and other things. And if anybody has any questions later on about MACDC's advocacy, you can email me at donb@macdc.org. And that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Don. I really appreciate you sharing what you guys are working on. So next we're going to go to Engine 6. They're our local partner in Newton for the Municipal Engagement Initiative, and we've got Kathleen Hobson joining us.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be with you. So Dana, you told us to mostly focus on our biggest challenges rather than on anything else.
That would be great, yeah.
So our longstanding persistent challenge is the size and composition of our special permit granting authority, which is our city council, which has 24 members, 3 per ward. That's by far our toughest problem. Also, the mechanism in our city charter that makes it pretty easy to appeal land use decisions by ballot petition. which almost happened to us on Super Tuesday, but we won that battle for Northland. And then the composition of our zoning board of appeals, which determines variances and 40B permits. One of the members has a master's in planning, and her thesis was titled "Wrong Again, Massachusetts Affordable Housing Statute and Smart Growth Zoning." So that's what we're up against on the ZBA. So our biggest challenge right now, though, and for the next year and a half, will be zoning reform. It's a process that the city began about 4 years ago. We've finally jumped into the process. Engine 6 has since, at the beginning of this year. It had been put on pause for a little while. And the struggle we're having is righting a ship that's already kind of out in open water, going in the wrong direction, we think. It was billed to the city, to residents, as a chance to preserve what we love about the city and minimize tear downs and McMansions and that kind of thing, minimizing change. And we think actually the city's done itself a disservice, because we actually need people to think more about change and how exciting that could be, how the fact that a city that's majority single family zoned needs to make more room for more people, and the code's in the way. We need to change that. And so we've actually started to influence the conversation. There is a draft ordinance and map under review by the City Council right now. And thanks to some prodding from us, they have finally adopted sort of higher level goals of housing production and climate change mitigation. So that's good. But the problem will continue to be getting the public with us and off of the idea that it's all about preservation and onto the idea that we need change, and change can be exciting. Rachel Heller summarized the vastness of the problem that we're up against with education in a recent newsletter, when she said that the policies that created the segregation we're still experiencing have to be intentionally changed, and the change depends on people who don't see the barriers, who don't know what it's like to have the police called on them because they're walking down the street. So that's what we're trying to do, is educate people and get the mayor involved. We need her leadership. We've sent her several letters, and we now finally have a meeting with her in a couple weeks, actually, which is great. And I wanted to say that the two things that made a big splash amongst counselors and others who responded to the letters that we've sent the city are Rachel's letter that she titled Black Lives Matter, and the Segregated by Design video, which is like the 20-minute version of Color of Law. Just FYI. Also, at the very beginning of the chat, by the way, I put in a link to a side-by-side comparison of the 1938 redlining map of Newton and the current draft zoning map. And wherever there is green and blue, you will see single-family housing. I mean, it's like nothing's changed, and nothing will change if we can't, correct course, basically. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. And yes, you'll have to go all the way back up to the top of the chat to see what Kathleen shared there, but you could also go to the Engine 6 website. A lot of great resources there, and it's been a pleasure working with you guys. Thank you.
I just reshared it, actually.
Excellent. So folks don't have to scroll all the way. So next we're going to go to our partners over in Medford, from Housing Medford. I think we have Alex Lucenhop and Roberta Cameron on the line. Roberta, are you able to share?
Yes.
Thanks.
So what we've been working on over in Medford, we back at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we looked at how we could use CPA funds to start an emergency rental assistance program, and we committed very quickly $270,000 of CPA funds to create an emergency rental assistance program that is being administered by two partner agencies, ABCD and Housing Families, Inc. And we're very excited to work with them because we haven't done a program like this in Medford so far, and they're new partners for us for CPA funds. But in implementing this program, it's been surprisingly slow to be absorbed, the funds that were committed. And so, you know, looking at why this is, I think the #1 reason has been that it is the people who need this program the most are the hardest to reach people in the community. And we simply lack a communication infrastructure in Medford that enables us to get city information or, you know, any kind of public information out to certain neighborhoods of the city where people are less connected with each other and less connected with the city, and to lower income populations and minority populations. So we've been looking at ways that we can build that communication infrastructure. It also dovetails with, you know, just in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of talk about racial tensions in Medford. We've had a long history. It's a very diverse community, and there have been over people's lifetimes, they can remember tensions breaking out in Medford. So the escalating cost of housing contributes to social inequity, but it is also part of this lack of our ability to communicate with each other, and for, you know, city resources to be equally accessible to all members of the community. So that's the one side. There's a lot going on in Medford otherwise. We have, for the first time in decades, not having no 40B proposals in decades, we have now 3 in the pipeline that I don't have off the top of my head the number of units. It's huge. It will bring us well over the 10% of everything in the pipeline, and we're well below 10% right now if everything in the pipeline were to be developed. And it highlights the urgency that we have, long-standing urgency to modernize our zoning. I just the other day compared a 1965 zoning map to today, and there's no change. We really have not touched zoning in anybody's lifetime here that I know of. You know, I could be corrected. So we have a lot of, there isn't really a great understanding of how to guide land use policies. So everyone across the board, elected officials, staff, the public, you know, advocates, we all need to get up to speed on how this works and how to do it, and try to get ahead of it so that we can try to guide the conversation in the right direction, because there's a lot of people who really want to see Medford retain some affordability as we see it getting out of reach for people. And there are a few other small things that we're advocating for, but those are the big ones. And we're hoping in particular that our fiscal situation in the coming year enables us to follow through with the plans to increase our planning capacity in the city, which has been just under capacity for forever, and to be able to follow through with the intention of preparing a master plan, and then followed by a consultant-led zoning initiative. So that's what we have on the table right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. You guys have been doing tremendous work in Medford, and I'm really proud to have been able to partner with you. So I believe that we have Chris Norris is on the phone. Chris, if you are on the phone and can unmute yourself, you can press *6 and share with us what's going on over at Metro Housing Boston. Also proud to partner with you.
Hi, Dana. Thanks so much. And yes, I made it. Anyhow, I want to thank Rachel and Dana and the entire CHAPA team for including Metro as a partner. And I'm just want to briefly talk about 3 things that Metro is focused on that apply across the region. One is Raft, Residential Assistance for Families in Transition. And just this week, we finally exhausted $5.1 million. But folks should still be applying because there is new money coming very quickly. I assume Eric will talk about that on the policy side, but we are still processing applications. There will be funds available. So that is something that is continuing, even though you may hear that the funds are exhausted. The second is a new program that Undersecretary Maddox had mentioned on a CHAPA call a while ago. It hasn't been announced yet by the governor, but it's scheduled to begin on July 1st. And it's basically Raft, but for people who are between 50% and 80% of area median income. And folks do not need to submit a separate application for that. It will be a combined application with Raft. So again, folks should just submit that, and the details will come out as soon as the governor makes his announcement, most likely next week. And then the third piece is for folks that have vouchers already, the ability to get interim rent adjustments. We've seen a huge increase in terms of the number of requests for those. We've contacted everyone that we know who has one of our vouchers, who has earned income or had earned income. And so, we've seen that spike. But if you hear from folks, if you have clients or constituents or other people that have vouchers, making sure that they're requesting those rent adjustments because their incomes have dropped, that would go a long way. And I know Steve Farrell is on the call as well. And so if I didn't say, use resource line at metrohousingboston.org. And folks are responding to those emails directly for all of those things I just talked about. And we will get whatever assistance people need out to them. And thank you to CHAPA for all of the positive policy advances, particularly around these programs that we've seen in the last few weeks.
Thank you so much, Chris. And we really appreciate your partnership and the amazing work. I mean, the numbers are actually really astounding, but I love hearing about these new programs coming on, and we definitely will be talking about that as the call goes on, but also the idea that no door is the wrong door. People should be applying and finding a way to get assistance, whether it's one income bracket or another. So thank you very much. All right, so now we're going to go over to Revere. Beth Rosa, are you here from the Revere, the City of Revere and the Revere Housing Coalition? Okay, she may not have been able to join us yet, so we'll move on to our next person. We're going to go to the town of Arlington. We have several partners from the town of Arlington. We've been working with them through our municipal engagement initiative as well, and there's several groups that have come out of that work. Or the first that was well established before we even started in Arlington was the Housing Corporation of Arlington. Pam, are you available to speak? Unmute yourself. You don't hear Pam. Okay, maybe we're having trouble with folks unmuting themselves. Let's go to Ben Rudick from Arlington Neighbors for More Neighbors. Ben, are you there?
Yes, hello. Oh,
okay,
hi. I'm Ben. This is Talia. Oh, I just woke her up. I'm sorry. So yeah, Arlington Neighbors for More Neighbors is an advocacy group. We're focused on secure and affordable housing for everyone, abundant and secure housing for all. It's so wonderful to be part of this CHAPA call. It can be a very lonely experience advocating in each of our own towns, and to see that there is a larger group here that we can be a part of and learn from is really exciting. We're also a licensed offshoot of the Minneapolis Neighbors for More Neighbors, which I'm sure many of you know the amazing zoning reforms that Minneapolis achieved about a year and a half ago, including ending single-family zoning across Minneapolis, eliminating parking minimums, increasing density along transit. Those are all things that we would hope to achieve as well. Our biggest challenge, and also an opportunity, is that the zoning reforms that we had been advocating for have all been tabled due to COVID. Our town meeting form of government, we bring 252 town meeting members all together, crammed together on the floor of town meeting, of town hall. And in order to make that as small and safe of a gathering as possible, we tabled all non-essential changes to law, including a large raft of zoning reform. Now, I actually think that was a good thing. The reason being is that with the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a much greater willingness from people to engage with the history of zoning and housing use in Arlington, and namely sort of the many decisions we made to become and remain a majority white town. We were 99% white through the 70s, and that was intentional and was driven by our racist and segregationist land use and zoning and housing policy. And so I think that there is much more openness now to having conversations about what is the history of our zoning and land use, and then how we can best address that now to make our town a more diverse and inclusive place. In fact, that bring up one specific example. We had a listening session earlier in the week where the community came together and had a chance to talk about sources of structural racism in Arlington. And that conversation had previously been dominated largely by the police and the schools, but there has been a huge swell in interest in discussing housing. And in fact, our town manager, Adam Chapdelaine, mentioned specifically that other places have unlimited single-family zoning or are discussing it. And one thing he said that will stick with me for a long time is he specifically said that when people bring up protecting neighborhood character, that is dog whistle racism for I don't want people like me living here. And I just could not imagine something like that coming from a town manager's mouth. That was very, very exciting. And so I think our challenge now is to best harness the moment and harness the energy to get people more informed about housing and zoning, and what the history is that has led us to this point, and then hopefully have a productive conversation about where to go from here. So thank you so much for including us in this conversation.
Thank you, Ben. And I love a meeting that includes a baby. So thank you for bringing that to this meeting. I always appreciate that. Especially when it's not mine doing weird things behind me, distracting.
I won't say it was a choice, but I'm glad that she's back asleep again. Okay, that's good.
Good. Zoning put her to sleep. We hope that's not the conversation for the rest of you. So I'm going to go one more time. We had a couple of other co-sponsors, and I want to just make sure if they're on the phone or on the call, I'll give them one last chance to speak up. Steve Revelak from Equitable Arlington, are you able to join us and unmute yourself? If you're on the phone and called in, you can press *6. And Pam or Beth, if you are able to join us, we'll give you a chance to speak as well.
Steve?
Oh, here's Barbara.
Yes.
Oh, Barbara, wonderful.
Yes. Steve wasn't able to make it today, so I'm going to just say a couple of words about Equitable Arlington. And I know Pam was on the call at the beginning, and I know Alex Bagnell is on the call too from Arlington. So we are well represented here. Equitable Arlington is sort of the educational, it was started by Steve Revelak, and Steve is an incredible, tenacious researcher, and he started gathering data and, for example, found the covenants that are on some of the early mortgages in Arlington that says you can't limits who you can sell to. You can't sell to anyone who's Black. And he's done a lot of other work leading to some legislation. As Ben said, we have a lot of legislation coming up, hopefully this fall, on zoning. EquitableArlington.org is the website, and we try and post the information that comes from all of the wealth of research that's done in Massachusetts, as well as nationally, as well as our own local stuff. So it's in a way, it's kind of a repository. The only other comment I would make about Arlington is that I think we, knock on wood, are doing pretty well in our change-making position here, and that is because we've got the NIMBY people on the other side that have been so difficult to work with in the town, and so contradictory, and so insulting to the town people, and we're nice that we win. We've won a lot of attention in the town, I think, because of that, because we're trying to keep it level and database driven, etc.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for joining us. And thank you to everyone in Arlington. And I actually think Jenny Raitt from the town of Arlington is on the call as well. So thank you to all of our local partners and our co-sponsors. So I'm going to go from here. I'm going to reshare my screen. And we're going to get into, oops, Hang on one second. I'm going to reshare my screen in a second. My apologies for some of these Zoom problems. Okay. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Abidnia Curvey, who's going to talk to us about state policy updates. Abi, go ahead.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you everybody for joining us. I am Abi Curvey. I'm the policy associate working with our policy team at CHAPA. And I know we have been having these conversations with a lot of you over the last couple of months and even before that. As COVID sort of came in, we have sort of changed our policies, or not changed, but sort of diverted our focus to policies that are specifically, for COVID response and recovery, at the same time not losing eye on the priorities that we have had before. And in that sense, CHAPA has always been working on to ensure that people in Massachusetts have a safe place to call home. But during COVID times, we have even more, tried hard to focus that our policies are equitable and make sure that there is a place, because without having a home, it'll be hard to keep your health. And right now, no other moment in time has highlighted this point more than this before, that housing is health, and how interrelated those things are. Next slide, Jen. And with that, we have tried to ensure that our equitable policies, we are trying to advocate not only for renters, but also for homeowners, ensuring that our housing ecosystem is stabilized during this crisis and we are able to recover safely through these times. With that, some of the policies that we have been working on, the major one that we have been working on is expansion of Raft. As Chris talked about, that was sort of the first response, that as the moratorium is sort of coming to an end, whenever that ends, it is going to be really necessary that we already have in place a resource for families or households to ensure that they have their rents paid. There was some money that was given in the supplemental budget for the expansion of Raft for COVID. There was also from the houses side an increase in cap from 4,000 to 10,000, what we have been advocating for. But we also have been advocating for more money for the HCECs, which are sort of the frontline agencies for providing a Raft. And as we just want to ensure that there is not a huge tidal wave of evictions that come across as the eviction moratorium ends, and making sure that we have the resources so that families can pay the rent is really, really essential. And that's where we have been advocating for that. Now, 50 million is sort of the initial money that we are advocating for. If we go by MAPC's values, it's the resources that are needed are a lot higher than that. But right now, this is the money we are going with, and we'll be recalculating our asks as we move forward. And also making sure that we have enough funding for HCECs, which are sort of taking in the housing applications, and I've seen a huge surge in housing applications for Raft and other resources. Also, as we are looking at how to expand resources, we already have a lot of resources coming in from the federal side, and ensuring that we coordinate these federal resources to make sure the programs that are really in need get those resources. We have been working to coordinate our responses, especially for funds like the Emergency Solutions Grant that Ryan will talk about, but making sure that those grants are administered in a way that is equitable and ensuring that it's most effective for housing people. Another legislation that we have been supporting is the right to counsel. There was a bill that was filed before COVID, but this one specifically is a pilot program that would provide legal representation in eviction proceedings for tenants and owner occupants at a certain income, and especially in areas that are highly affected by COVID. Because as the evictions start pouring in, when the moratorium ends, having a legal counsel can really increase the chances of those tenants to preserve their tenancies and ensure that there is the eviction number is not a crazy high number. At the same time, as some of the speakers pointed out, housing choice legislation is something that we have been really pushing forward for the last couple of months before COVID, and we are not letting our eye off it. Just recently, the economic development bill that was proposed by the governor had the housing choice legislation provision in it, which would reduce the threshold for voting from 2/3 supermajority to simple majority for some zoning ordinances, and this would really help gain more support for affordable housing and ensure that the supply side of things are at least somewhere nearer to what we really need them to be. And so that there has been some movement on that. There is a hearing coming up tomorrow on the economic development bill that has the housing choice provision. So we will be advocating for that as well. So these are some of the things that we have been working on legislatively. In terms of our budget priorities, there's a lot to consider, and there's a lot going on as well. There was a supplemental budget filed, which had a lot of provisions. I'll put up a link where we list what all was included in the supplemental budget on the House version, and along with some money for public housing authorities and homeless shelters. There was 20 million for Raft. Now we need to ensure that this gets through the Senate, just the way it was passed in the House. And so we will be advocating for that as well. We are not letting our eye off the FY 2021 budget as well. We need to ensure that programs like MRBB, AHBB, the housing voucher programs they're not getting any funding cuts, and they are funded, at least at the same level as they were last year. Because as we move forward through the economic recovery, it is really important that none of these programs are cut, and we also make sure that there is money for programs like Raft. And also, we strongly support permanent supportive housing. There was 5.8 million in the supplemental budget as well, and so we want to ensure that even the shelters, especially those providing specific services for people with special needs, are getting those resources and are able to stay housed and keep themselves healthy at this time. So those are just a snapshot of what we have been working on. There's a lot more going on, and I would definitely encourage all of you to go on our website and check out our priorities and the work that we have been doing, and I'll talk more about what exactly you can do and how can you contribute to this effort shortly. But for now, I'll pass it on to Ryan for federal updates.
Thank you, B. So again, this is Ryan Dominguez, Policy Analyst at CHAPA. And as part of my work here at CHAPA, I help to coordinate the New England Housing Network. And together as a network, we've been advocating down in DC for various investments in housing and homelessness that were included in both the CARES Act as well as the House's HEROES Act. And we'll continue to do so and advocate for as much funding we can get from the federal government to go into any next kind of stimulus package for housing and homelessness. But as Abhi had said, we had now turned our attention more to what is going on in the state and making sure that the funds from the CARES Act were actually allocated to the communities that really need it and towards housing and homelessness. So we've been focused on 3 sources of funding here in Massachusetts. The first one is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or CRF. The second one is the Community Development Block Grants, or CDBG. And lastly, it's the Emergency Solutions Grants, or ESG. So to give you a little bit of an overview, the Coronavirus Relief Fund is the largest sum of money that Massachusetts has received. In total, it received $2.7 billion. And of that total, Massachusetts is going to put out around 25% directly to cities and towns. So that's in total about $502 million. So to give you a little bit of a local snapshot, Boston received $120 million directly from the federal government, and then the state is going to give out around $7.8 million for Newton and around $4 million for Arlington. So other states around the country have used this funding for things like emergency rental assistance, funding housing counseling, as well as for gap financing for new affordable housing developments. So the next one is the Cdbg program, and to give you a little bit of a local snapshot, Boston received around $10 million for CDBG, Newton received $1.1 million for CDBG, and Arlington received $660,000. So you all might have heard, but Boston used around half of it, so $5 million to put into its rental relief fund for emergency rental assistance. So, if possible, I would really push for you as local advocates to do the same in your cities and towns. And lastly, there's the ESG program, which can be used for shelter costs as well as rapid rehousing. The Commonwealth received around $104 million for ESG, and Boston received around $28 million, and Newton received around $1.4 million. So before I kick it back to Abi, I'll just say as local advocates, I think that you can really have an impact by contacting your city councilors, the mayors, as well as any of the other local municipal officials who will be making decisions about where these funds will be allocated. And if you can ask them to have a public process, an RFP, and really make comments about making housing and homelessness a priority for all of these funds, I think that can go a long way. So with that, I'll kick it back to Abi.
Thanks, Ryan. And I just shared a couple of resources on some of the item priorities I talked about. What can you do now? As Ryan pointed out, there's a lot of money that is flowing in on the local level, and there's a lot that can be done with that. We know that as one of the speakers said, that some funds have been used from CBA for rental assistance programs. There's also some funds from the federal money being used for rental assistance programs, and we want to ensure that all these programs along with Raft are sort of complementary and filling the gaps where another program cannot be used. And so there's a lot that can be done on the local level. I've just now shared a sample advocacy letter that you can use to sort of reach out to the municipal officials and ask them to be engaged in this process of decision making on those federal funds and make sure that they are used for programs that are for housing and really important. On the state level, you can advocate to your state legislator to expand Raft. That's the top priority, but you can ask them to advocate for all other priorities, but we definitely want Raft to be expanded, and with 6.25 million for HCECs. And we'll be updating that ask as we go forward. So you can please do contact your legislator and ask them to support this. Raft, I'm just seeing in the chat, somebody has asked, what is Raft? It's the Residential Assistance for Families in Transition. It's a short-term assistance program that currently provides up to $4,000 a household for any housing-related cost. It can be back rent, back mortgages, any condo fees, any sort of assistance that is required for a family to stay housed where they are. So it's a really flexible program that can be very helpful right now for people to pay their rents or mortgages. And we are trying to expand it up to $10,000. That's been our advocacy ask. Getting back to what you can do now, you can also join CHAPA committees. We have a lot of committees where these discussions take place, where we sort of form our policy positions, and they are focused on budget resources, our Building Blocks Coalition. They are focused on housing stability and economic mobility for homelessness prevention, on public housing and rental assistance. It's really easy to join these committees now because they're all virtual and happening online, and it's really great if you can be engaged and provide your input so we can support comprehensive policies and advocate for them in a coalition-based way. So I really suggest all of you check that out, and I'm happy to answer any questions. The one last thing I'll share is also a sample letter for Raft that you can use to reach out to your legislator and ask them to support expansion of Raft. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dana or take any questions.
Abi, I see just one question for you here about the increase to the 10,000. Is it dependent on the Senate passing this change in the supplemental budget?
Yes, so if the Senate also supports the same language, then that we will be increasing the cap for 10,000.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna thank you both, Abi and Ryan, for sharing all that information and also all the work that you guys do. I'm so proud to call you my colleagues. I'm gonna hand it off to another colleague I'm proud to work with, Whitney Demetrius, to tell us a little bit more about our Municipal Engagement Initiative.
Thanks, Dana. Happy to be talking with you guys a little bit about the program. Really our goal is to build support for affordable housing across the Commonwealth. And we know that local support can really make or break new development. And so back in 2008, they decided to start this program so that we, Dana and I, have the great opportunity to bring together the minds like you all, and bring them around these different housing issues. Really, our local strategy is to support efforts in each community to build a welcoming community for affordable housing, right? Welcoming to affordable housing and expanding housing opportunities throughout those communities. And specifically, our ideal is to get as many of the voices at the table in support of a housing production in a sort of cohesive group, right? So it's remarkable that despite the fact that we know that this is what happens on the local level, things get done on the local level, many communities lack a strong advocacy group for housing. And so our goal is really to bring those voices together. And right now we are in several communities. Those include Revere, Arlington, Newton, and Medford, as well as Essex, Amherst, Acton, and Foxborough. And then we also have our MEI Light communities, including Agawam and Brookline. So again, each of those communities are different and unique in their own right. And we approach it with different strategies in terms of their size of government, their concerns, etc. And so, they're facing different levels of opposition. And so we develop different strategies in terms of how we begin the work there. But in line with what Ryan and Abhi had talked about in terms of what you can do, we know that many of you all are doing work in silos. The goal is really to break those silos of the work that you guys are doing individually and sort of help create a cohesiveness. So if you're interested in doing this sort of work, like many of those folks have been able to do, sort of our guideline is to sort of identify who those core folks are in your community that you should be talking to. Who are the folks on the ground that are those change agents that are doing this work? Who are the partners sort of thinking outside of the box of just housing? Should you be working with business leaders, religious leaders, and folks who are on school boards, et cetera, to sort of expand the interest of folks who are interested in housing, because those things are all interrelated. Sort of begin to have those conversations, use the data to sort of guide your conversations and really to just get started. So what we have done on our website is we have an MEI Light toolkit, which is to help you all sort of guide you through beginning to put together a coalition, a group of folks who are advocates for housing and affordable housing. So the idea is that you can go on the site, you can look at our strategies around who are stakeholders, thinking outside the box of who that is, what does a launch meeting look like, a potential agenda, and there's a lot of resources there we love for you to look into. And again, what we also have on the site is a tell us where you live tool so that you can let us know where you live. We know where many of you all work in terms of our members, but we love to know where you live so that we can connect you with other folks who are also interested in doing this sort of work. Dana and I have the pleasure of really connecting neighbors and sort of activating them. And so we are glad to answer any questions that you may have and expanding the work in your communities. And I think like Benjamin said, sort of harnessing this moment that we're in as well to bring those voices together specifically to talk about housing. There's so many things you can do. You can do forums, you can put together op-eds, you can do a button campaign like one of our communities have done, and so much more to really make the impact. So I'll hand it over to Dana to talk a little bit about some data that will sort of guide our conversations, because we really do want to hear from you all today. But again, do reach out to us if you're interested in some of this work.
Thank you, Whitney. So we're getting really close to when we want to hear from you. But I want to share just a little bit of data and context from our research partners that we always look to so that we can frame this conversation. So the slide I'm sharing here is from the COVID Community Data Lab. I know many of you have probably taken a look at this website, but if you haven't, I really encourage you to go ahead and take a look. One of the things in particular that they've been able to do is start to look at which factors might be related to communities that have higher COVID-19 case rates. The slide that I'm showing here is about the fact that communities of color, particularly Black and Brown communities, have been seen to have higher COVID-19 case rates. And I want to highlight in particular Revere on this call. You can see it in the middle of the screen. Revere has a case rate of 316 resident cases per 10,000 residents. That's as of June 3rd. It has overcrowding, which has been related to higher case rates of 5%. That's high. It sounds low, but it's high compared to many other communities. 50% of the residents in Revere are frontline workers, which has a strong correlation, and 46% of its residents are of color, and 13% of its households are in poverty. So when we're talking about COVID-19 and who we should be supporting and who needs additional support, you want to keep these things in your mind, and I think this website has been really helpful in doing that. You can go to that website and dig into your own community as well to see where your community lands. At the beginning of the call, Whitney had shared that 22% of households were unable to make their rent or mortgage payments in May. I think that's really critical to understand, and it's the reason we're fighting so hard for some of the protections that we have. But when we dig into it even deeper, you can see that lower income households are even more likely to have been unable to make those payments. This again is from the COVID Community Data Lab. You can see lower income households are much more likely to have made no payment or made a partial payment. And what that means is, even though we have an eviction and a foreclosure moratorium in place right now, when that is lifted, when those bills come due, they're going to have a big bill to provide back to their landlord or their bank, and they may not be able to do that. These are residents who were already more vulnerable prior to COVID-19 and are more vulnerable right now. And what's concerning me, and I know many of my colleagues even more, is how we're going to move forward in the future. Again, we have the eviction and foreclosure moratoriums, but less than half of surveyed renters and homeowners could afford their current housing costs for the next 3 months. So it's just going to keep piling up. And again, it's going to impact those lower income households even more. I do want to share a little data from the MAPC COVID-19 layoff housing gap report. They did some great work to share, you know, what is the impact that we're looking at. And I think one thing that everyone's been asking for is this data by municipality, and they have just this week released that data by municipality. So not right now, I want you to stay with us in this conversation, but please make sure you go to their website and take a look at the map, and you can actually download all the data by each municipality. But overall, they're looking at, you know, with the expanded CARES Act unemployment benefits, there's still 7,800 renters and 7,700 owners who are having trouble paying for their basic needs. And then, you know, again, more concerning going forward, if these same workers are still unable to work in August, even after all of these protections end, there's going to be an even bigger bill to pay. You know, if they look at the average monthly assistance that a renter of $935 is looking for, or $1,290 per owner household to fill the gap, there's a statewide assistance gap of $195 million monthly. Again, looking at Revere, if we look at that municipal level data, they estimate over $2 million in housing assistance need in Revere. They have had 6,960 unemployment claims, and that results in about 1,800 households who need assistance. So just to get some scope of the problem that we're dealing with, I think it's critical. So these are the regional topics that we've been talking with our regional partners about. Certainly the emergency rental assistance programs, you know, Chris spoke about what's happening at Metro Housing Boston and what's happening with Raft, and also at the local level where there are emergency rental assistance programs cropping up. But we want to hear from you. What do we think is going to happen when the moratorium is lifted and unemployment ends? What are you seeing for people's ability to access those funds? Certainly we've seen people raising concerns about language barriers and internet barriers, and just gaining access to the resources and even knowing that they're eligible. Roberta spoke about that. And then also coordination of these programs and funds. We will be releasing a report very soon that we did in conjunction with MHP and DHCD on where there are local emergency rental assistance programs and what some of the components of those programs are, but how do we make sure that no door is the wrong door, that people get to the resources that they need, and that they find the programs that they're eligible for. We've certainly been hearing concerns about serving undocumented immigrants. Even if undocumented immigrants are eligible for resources for rental assistance or mortgage assistance, often that there's a miscommunication that they aren't, or that they would be reported for availing them of those resources. So we just want to make sure that there's extra care and attention being paid to undocumented immigrants in all of our outreach and materials that we're sharing. We're hearing some concerns about this issue of what is overcrowding versus density. Is there going to be a concern with creating multifamily housing and living in dense communities? You know, there is a difference between overcrowding and density. Overcrowding, where more people are living in a unit than makes sense or than fits comfortably or is safe or adequate, versus density, when there are more units in a space, but everyone is safely and adequately housed. And we want to make sure that that's on the radar, because we've been hearing some backlash against these concerns. We have heard some concerns about permitting. You know, are there communities having the ability to continue forward with their progress in permitting and funding of projects? We know we still need new affordable housing to continue to move forward. We've heard some reports of stall tactics, of things not moving forward because everyone's focused so much on COVID-19, but we've also heard some really encouraging things about projects moving forward. So just want to hear from you. We have also heard from some of our regional partners that subsidized housing has been a place with lower rates of COVID-19. And that's really encouraging, because number one, it means people are, safely housed in housing that is affordable, and it also is protecting them. You know, we see housing as healthcare all the time, but in this moment, even more. So we've heard from some of our partners who are working on property management that when people are safely and adequately housed in housing that they don't pay too much for, they are not as likely to be exposed to COVID-19. And lastly, we always want to raise the issue of racial equity in our conversation. Several of our partners who spoke at the beginning raised that up as a concern that they're looking at. How are they changing zoning and local housing practices to make sure that we are elevating racial equity in all of our local communities? So I know that's a lot to think about and talk about, but what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to put us all on the screen, and I want to hear from you. So please feel free to raise your hand. You can use the raise hand function, or you can just physically raise your hand, although it might be hard for me to see everyone with about 100 people on the call. But please raise your hand and we'll go from there, or you can write a comment in the chat as well. Everyone's being shy, but I know folks have things to share. Why don't we go, I see here, Dawn talked a little bit. Dawn, I'm going to put you on the spot. You shared in the chat that density can be a remedy for overcrowding. Can you speak a little bit about what you guys are hearing and working on that level?
Sure. At a CHAPA session, I don't know, a month ago, someone from the neighborhood developers gave a nice presentation about how their COVID rates were lower than the surrounding community in Chelsea, and that overcrowding was a serious problem in Chelsea, but yet their housing, which was very dense, was helping to solve that problem. Also, Two Life Communities talked at that same session about their efforts to address the problems of very high-risk population, very older seniors, and again, having dense housing, but having a strategy where they would intensely provide services to the seniors, keep them in place, provide meals, do their laundry. So I think density, if done by a responsible project sponsor / owner, can be an excellent remedy for dealing with the problems of overcrowding and with a pandemic like COVID.
Thank you, Dawn. Yeah, I think that's critical, and especially when we're talking about concerns that people may have going forward with development, to be able to look to those examples as places where those fears have not been founded, and in fact, quite the opposite. Other folks want to share? You can see in the chat, all of these materials are going to be shared on our website, and this recording will also be uploaded. So I see a couple of hands raising. Ann Mara, would you like to go ahead? You can unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering, I was hoping to get a little more information about the housing choice bill. Just really, is it going to be picked back up I understand why it was put to the side. I understand maybe it's involved, it's been incorporated into another bill. I mean, our particular state legislators aren't necessarily, or at one point we're not very supportive, and we had a plan to meet, and I'm wondering, we got to get back on that plan and start talking to them about it again. So just, does anybody know any timing or anything about that?
Yes, and I think B, are you still there? Are you able to speak to that?
I'm sorry, I was out for a minute. So
okay,
about
just asking about housing choice legislation and what the timeline is on that, and any more update on that.
So the good thing is it was a part of the economic development bill, and there is a hearing by invite only for tomorrow for the bill, and that's a good sign in the sense that the committee is looking at it. And if usually the economic development bill sort of goes to the finish line right at the last minute on last day of the session. So there is a hope. We are pushing for that. And as soon as it is, I mean, whenever it does happen, it goes into effect immediately. So we are hopeful, but I do not have I cannot give you a definite timeline. We are advocating for it.
Thank you.
I mean, our ideal timeline was to get it done before the Springtown meetings, but with COVID, all those plans were sort of shelved.
Great, thank you. So I see also a hand raised by Tom Gagan. Tom, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Tom Gagan. I'm Engine 6 in Newton. I think this is a great meeting. Thank you to CHAPA for setting it up. I was particularly struck by the remarks from people from Medford and Arlington who said that they were thinking about changing the zoning in their community because, as Kathleen Hobson said, we're thinking of doing the same thing here, and it's very difficult. But I wonder if other communities besides those three are also thinking of changing zoning. Is this a trend, in other words? I don't know.
Yeah, any other communities, feel free to unmute yourself and share if there are efforts going on in your community. I see Joan is raising her hand. Joan, do you want to share a little bit about what you guys are trying to do in Brookline?
Yeah, I think that we've been doing these housing forums to educate kind of a cross section of activists, transportation and economic development and racial equity and housing and climate. And I think, all of our goal is that in order to get more housing affordability at various price points, the missing middle and the lower end of the spectrum, we are going to have to have some significant zoning change. And so part of our goal is to build the constituency that can go up against the NIMBY contingent, which is certainly very strong and very vocal in some of the same ways that somebody just described. I think it was one of the Arlington people said the dog whistle of, preserving the character of the neighborhood, as a dog whistle for not changing. And so the only way that we can hope to change the zoning here is if we have a really, really broad-based constituency to fight.
Thank you, Joan. I appreciate that. I see Marwa, you also have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I work at the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless. And as our name denotes, we primarily work with people who are experiencing homelessness and do a lot of policy and legislation around that. And, I think we all know that housing and homelessness are intricately tied to one another, whether that's through the systems that people interact with or that is through funding. And one of the things that a large swath of homelessness advocates, whether it's for people who are in individual shelters, people who are in family shelters, one of the big things that we've really been focusing on as this pandemic has continued is what is not only our response during the pandemic, but how are we reimagining these systems after the pandemic? Because as they currently exist and have existed, they are not sufficient and they are harmful. And as they continue to exist, it's simply impossible for them to continue to exist the way that they do you know, we don't have a vaccine yet, et cetera, et cetera. And so a big thing that we are looking at is in coordination with, you know, national partners like the National Income Housing Coalition and some other acronym heavy organizations who are doing that big national work. We're looking really to incorporate a lot of these housing policies and ideas into the work and make sure that the funding sources that we are looking at are kind of in conjunction with this so that the world of housing homelessness is not so bifurcated. And so, yeah, have been following some really interesting recommendations coming out of those national policy bodies. And yeah, just inviting everyone on this call to really think about incorporating that into their vision as we go on. One of the things that we're excited about is really pushing this idea that we really can be housing first, even though we are a right to shelter state. Like, what would a housing first model look like? How are we going to make that possible with the potential policies and funding sources we have available? And I know Felipe from Moses Place is on the call too, if he wants to say a little bit more about what I've said. But I'm going to put the framework that we are mostly working with into the chat. It's a really awesome framework that incorporates public health, you know, racial equity, anti-racism, not only racial equity, but anti-racism specifically, into the chat, and people can take a look and kind of get more of a sense of the holistic future that we're looking forward to.
Thank you, Marwa. And yes, thank you for calling out anti-racism instead of just racial equity, and for sharing that framework. And yes, Felipe, I see that you have raised your hand, so please chime in. We'd love to hear from you.
Mara jumped in ahead of me, so I'm glad you prefaced with all that. My name is Felipe. I'm the Public Policy Director at Rosie's Place. We're the first women's shelter in America and more of a community center today. And, you know, we're in an interesting position where we directly serve individual women, but a lot of women with their families come through to us as well, dealing with their homeless and trying to find shelter. And, you know, just to reiterate what Marwa said, even though we do have a right to shelter state, it is unbelievably inadequate. It is not actually providing shelter to people. And at the end of the day, you know, families with kids are having to be walked to City Hall just to get a proof of verification. They have to go back to DHCD to get denied for housing. They then have to find another way to sleep somewhere else because the state is telling them you're not homeless enough. And so just want to highlight that to the group that's kind of the framework that we're dealing with. And even during this COVID crisis, while states like California were implementing programs like the Room Key program, which is really phenomenal way in creating a pathway from a crisis to housing, you know, Massachusetts just sat on its hands and let people who are experiencing homelessness stay on the street and literally have higher rates of COVID than many other populations among their groups. Some shelters had even 100% COVID testing happening in them. So it's, you know, something that I wanted to bring up to you all as a highlight that, you know, the housing process that we go through, we got to really make sure that it includes the people that are pretty much forgotten. And, you know, we support the stuff that you guys have all talked about, working on Raft, we've been pushing Raft, pushing home base, making sure we have a proper RTC, either that permanently or a pilot. And like what we're looking at is where do we go from here, right? What's the systemic fix moving from here on? Because we've got all these really good policies to prevent, and the state has really done a bad job. I'm not gonna miss words. It's a really bad job of getting people from crisis to stability. And so I love the work you're all doing. We're totally behind you, and just want to think a little bit longer and a little deeper about how to get to that, solving the systemic issues.
Thank you both, Felipe and Marwa. I see Amy Coolidge has raised her hand. Amy, if you want to unmute and share your thoughts as well.
Hi, everyone. I just want to sort of pile on to the last two comments that were made by the callers. They're absolutely right. And there is, I think, a crisis on the horizon very soon with the homeless community. As you know, there have been many temporary shelters that have been set up.
Amy, you have a bit of an echo. I'm hearing it in some other folks as well. So I don't know if you can fix that. Just want to let you know folks are having a little trouble hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix it.
Okay.
You want me to? I'll put something in the chat instead.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. We'll try again in a minute. So I see Roberta also has raised her hand. Roberta. Oh, and now you're muted.
Sorry, thanks for letting me speak again. So I meant to add earlier, a couple of other things that we're working on are establishing an affordable housing trust. that will enable us to better collect funding and to be able to guide it and direct it toward affordable housing. And we're also advocating to see that more of our CDBG funds are used for affordable housing. In the past, we've used very little CDBG toward affordable housing. But really for all of these initiatives, so I talked earlier about our need to communicate with the public, but we also, like, really one of the most important things is to develop and strengthen our partnerships with organizations in our community and in the region, like ABCD and Housing Families Inc. and other organizations in the area, so that, because the city is not going to use the funds, we need these partners to use the funds, and we don't have those relationships in place with the partners who will build housing in our community and administer housing support programs. So building partnerships is also one of our big focuses right now.
Thank you, Roberta. I see Caitlin Golden has raised her hand. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you, and thanks so much for holding these meetings. I just wanted to add on to what folks were saying earlier, and what I think Amy Coolidge was starting to say is one thing that we're really concerned about right now is that a number of the temporary shelter locations that were set up in order to decongregate, depopulate shelters, those are going offline as schools, YMCAs, other places need their space back. And there's really going to be an issue with access to shelter, because shelters typically have just accepted whoever they can and had people sleeping on the floors, and they're not going to be able to do that anymore. So I think that the impending housing crisis is really serious in terms of where are people going to go. So we need to figure out how to transform the system so that people have access to more non-congregate shelter spaces, and then ultimately rapid rehousing and permanent housing as well.
Yes, and I see Amy, you anticipated exactly what Amy was going to say. She's giving you the thumbs up, and in the chat said exactly that, this capacity issue. And I think that's so critical. People have raised that, we've been able to really respond in this moment, but what's the crisis after the crisis? Where are we going from there? And thank you for raising that. I see that Nadine has her hand raised. Nadine? Yep, go ahead.
I didn't have my hand raised. Oh, thank you.
Okay. All right. We always love to hear from you, but we'll let it go because Marwa has her hand raised again. So Marwa, go ahead.
I think just to not necessarily respond, but to agree and say that yes, there are these temporary shelters that are expiring, and I think one of the things we've really been running into and could definitely use support from people on this call regarding is in our efforts. Policy and budget advocacy efforts to figure out a long-term solution that doesn't just have people going back to their shelters and has people actually transitioning to housing. We've run into a lot of well, there isn't money for that, or there isn't this for that, but there is, and we do have the paths to the solutions available to us. We just maybe don't have enough creative thinking or enough imagination, or we do have enough imagination, but maybe it's not all the way out there yet. And so I think it's, it's definitely important to look at the crisis as it exists right now, but to know that that crisis is manufactured in a very specific way. And as Felipe mentioned, from the beginning of the pandemic, we have been doing tons and tons of advocacy around sheltering and FEMA money and this and that, and none of those paths that are actually available to us and when you give us funding have been taken up. And so I think that's kind of an important thing for us to all be thinking about as a group, is that they exist, they're available to us, and we just need to be able to seize that power to use them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else? I don't see any hands raised, but would love to hear from other folks. We have about 5 more minutes to hear from you. It doesn't have to be something that I raise in my discussion questions. What are you really, struggling with, or even really great examples of how you've been responding to this moment and doing work in your local community? I'd love to hear it. Oh, Nadine now has her hand up. I knew I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Now that you called on me. So I just want to say that there are efforts to extend both the eviction and foreclosure moratorium, and that people should really be on the lookout for legislation that gets proposed and really contact their legislators to do it, because I think we all realize that this is not going to be over by August 18th, and people are really having difficulty making their mortgage payments and their rental payments. And we're very concerned about the level of evictions when this is all over with. So I throw that out.
Thank you, Nadine. And yes, we will follow that closely. Abhi, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great discussion point on when we think the moratorium should end. There is no precedent to this, so it's definitely something that needs to be discussed. And I would say that as much as that is important, it is, I mean, as much as we advocated for the eviction moratoriums, it is still a pause, and eventually that rent is going to have to be paid. And that is where resources like Raft are so critical, because at whatever point that rent or mortgages need to be paid, we need these resources to ensure there is some support for those households. And that is where our focus on Raft is coming from too.
Yes, thank you. Kathleen, go ahead.
Thank you. One thing that makes advocacy hard in a place like Newton is I don't think we've been keeping track of who lives in large developments. People refuse to believe, for example, but it's actually true that 30% of the residents at Avalon on Needham Street are seniors. There are people who just refuse to accept that this is a possibility. So it would be So is there any legal barrier to finding that information out? Like, it would be great to have the demographics of the larger apartment buildings.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't want to answer that question incorrectly. I mean, one thing I do know is that you could work with the municipality and the property owner to try to find some of that demographic information, but I don't want to answer it incorrectly. If someone else has an answer to that or has been able to do that in their community, please feel to pipe up. I also see that Ben Rudick has raised his hand, but Kathleen, if we don't have an answer to that, we can look into it for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a brief comment. For those that are looking at doing zoning reform, I would strongly recommend you take the time to learn a lot about what happened in Minneapolis for two reasons. One of which is the strategy that they had was tremendous. They built a very broad coalition of different groups, including environmentalists, racial equity, housing affordability. I don't think that you're able to create the magnitude of change that they created without a very broad coalition. And there are excellent arguments you can make to each of those groups. And also, as you look into the reporting on what happened in Minneapolis and why it happened, you'll just find a wealth of data and helpful arguments about, how to present these changes in the best light and what was effective. For instance, I learned a great deal myself about the history of racially motivated zoning in the U.S. by learning about what happened in Minneapolis as a case study, and there's lots of great links to the various Supreme Court cases and so on and so forth. So, I think that learning about what happened in Minneapolis is just a tremendous entryway into becoming aware of the whole issue and how to make change. And yeah, I would just say again, I think that you will be surprised how open people are to what I would consider to be. When I started talking in Arlington about, I think we should eliminate single family zoning, I started talking about that, about a year ago. And I was the crazy person at the housing meetings. So the pro was the crazy one. Like, well, Ben, he's weird. So maybe he'll talk about that and we'll get something reasonable done. But now the conversation's shifting, and it's shifting quickly. I mean, people are shocked when they learn that Arlington, our residential land is 79% single family zoning. And they're shocked to learn that single family zoning was explicitly a tool to keep areas segregated when racial segregation was no longer as legal. So, I would be ambitious and educate people and and think about some big proposals, because maybe your big proposal doesn't get through. I don't expect my single family zoning change will get through, but maybe it will provide some support to the more reasonable, more mainstream changes like accessory dwelling units or marginal upzoning along Mass Ave, for instance. But people are just so interested in that conversation now, and there's never been a better time to have it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And actually, Jack Cooper has just shared in the chat that unfortunately Pam Hallett from Arlington, her internet went down, so she wasn't able to join us.
Right.
We would have loved her to join us. Oh, there's Jack. But you wanted to share something? Yes.
Yes. The Housing Corporation has been, I'm a board member of the Housing Corporation, has been working on, for the past 20 years, trying to educate Arlington on affordability of housing, as a lot of folks here know. And, Pam specifically wanted me to let you know that we have raised $150,000 for folks who fall behind on their mortgages, on their rents, and that includes the most vulnerable, which is public housing folk can come and get their rent served also. So this is something what Ben is talking about. This is something that we have for a long time, but welcome to the community, Ben. It's the more the merrier, because as you know, Arlington does have some great citizens there, and they have some who are more conservative and don't want to see change. And I've lived there myself since 1984, so I have seen a lot. And I'll just leave it like that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack, for joining us and for sharing that. I know you have a wealth of information to share with us. I'm going to have time for just one more comment, and Deborah Goddard had raised her hand. So Deb, could you unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi all. Long time, but I'm back from New York. I just want to go back to the comment about maybe using demographics, for instance, the number of elderly, and just warn people that that also leads us down a dangerous road around discrimination against families with children. And most of you know that the easiest way in a difficult situation is to sell housing as for the elderly. And I think we need to be careful about using that flag. It's not helpful.
That was just an example. I mean, yeah.
Understood, but and by others it's used a lot.
Yes.
And I know Rachel and I have had a years-long battle about getting communities and people to think about that schism as discrimination. When I was at DHCD, I had to educate the Housing Appeals Committee that was discrimination. So,
yes, I very much appreciate that comment, and I appreciate that Kathleen does know that, but also making sure that everyone on the call sees that when we talk about one group versus another, what that impact might be, and certainly always keeping fair housing at the top of our mind. Whitney is particularly good at keeping that in my mind every time we have conversations about making sure fair housing is a consideration. I do see a couple of more comments in the chat, but we're coming right up against our time here. So someone did say, legal aid could be a big part of the response as we come up against the end of the eviction moratorium. Certainly, I know that folks at Greater Boston Legal Services and others are working, but are there others we can bring into the fold on that? And Joan has shared that the Brookline for Everyone, I believe it's called, or Brookline, Building a Better Brookline. Yes, Building a Better Brookline. Joan Lanecourt is from Building a Better Brookline, and they have been doing some forums. They have their next event is coming up on July 26th, and they have someone from Minneapolis coming to talk about their experience. So folks should join that. So I just want to go through a couple of last things from CHAPA's point of view. First of all, to thank all of you once again, and to thank our co-sponsors for their thoughtful comments, and Bank of America. Put in a final plug to please join a CHAPA committee. They are really where the work gets done and where we have these ongoing conversations. So please join us. You can do it all virtually. You can sign up for all of those on our website. Please attend forums. We have been continuing to do forums even in this moment of being socially distanced. You can see videos of a couple of our forums, including establishing an emergency rental assistance program and a forum on Raft are up on our website, and we have upcoming events, including our CHAPA dinner, which will look a little different this year, but we're still excited to gather and celebrate all of our exciting work on October 21st. And lastly, you can sign up for our monthly housing briefs, and you can become a CHAPA member, and you can also engage locally with the Municipal Engagement Initiative. So a final plug to go on our website to tell us where you live. You may work in one community but live in another, and you may not know that there's others who live in your neighborhood who are really engaged on this, and maybe coming together you can get something done. So with that, I will say thank you to all of you, and hope you have a great Thursday evening. Bye-bye.